Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the difference between the perception and the reality of the funding of the NHS and the danger posed to it by both Brexit and Boris Johnson. But first, if you'd like to receive notifications of my daily uploads, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification next to it. So the NHS is rightly respected and valued by members of the public in the UK. This is why Conservative governments always have to say they are increasing funding, whilst if you look at the figures, in reality they are always cutting funding. The way they deceive the public in terms of NHS funding falls into three main areas. The first one is just to simply lie about it. And it's not just Boris Johnson who lies as easily as he breathes. His predecessors also used to say that they were increasing funding in a budget, but that the money never made it to NHS bosses. And when challenged later on, they'd simply say they provided the funding after all. Stop moaning. Another classic example of this is Boris Johnson and his government claiming that they will fund 40 new hospitals if they win a general election. Now, as soon as they made that claim, it's a bit over a month ago, I think, very quickly, it was seen from the details that what they were actually talking about was 6 hospitals, not 40, it was 6. And it wasn't building 6 new hospitals, it was refurbishing them, which could just mean a lick of paint. There are no details on what that means at the moment. The second way that they deceive is by claiming that previous funding is new funding, so they try and count money 2 or even 3 times. This was highlighted recently when Boris Johnson claimed to have increased the funding of the NHS immediately upon becoming Prime Minister to the tune of £2 billion. In actual fact, he hadn't increased it by a penny. The money he was referring to was money provided for in his predecessor's budget and was already with the NHS. They just weren't allowed to spend it. All Boris Johnson did was say, oh, you know that money Theresa May gave you so that she could say she's funded the NHS, but you weren't allowed to spend it on healthcare. I'm now going to let you spend it. But even when the lie was exposed, they still kept up with it because not all journalists call them out on it. And they're getting that message to some people that they've straight up increased the funding by £2 billion when they haven't. And the third way is fiddling the figures. An example of this is during Theresa May's time, providing an actual increase in the NHS budget. And it was real. You look at the figures and you go, yeah, actually that figure has gone up. So it's a real NHS funding increase. That's odd for a Conservative Prime Minister because that's never happened before. And it was real, sort of. What she did is she took it from social services. So she didn't raise it through taxes. She just took it from social services. But then what she did is she told the NHS, oh, by the way, those social services aren't being funded anymore. We've given you the money. You'll have to do it. So May was able to say she'd increased the NHS budget, and it'd be very difficult to persuade someone otherwise because even if you look in the figures, it was technically increased. But she demanded that the NHS cover services that money was being spent on elsewhere. So there was no net benefit to the NHS. It didn't help the provision of healthcare. And as always is the case with these Tory games, the big losers are the British public, of course. So it's the fiddling of the figures, which is the latest example of the reason why the NHS needs a sickbed of its own and, well, why it could pass the point of no return should there be even one more Conservative government. Privatisation of public services is a bit of a bugbear of mine. What good is it doing anyone's healthcare by transferring public money, raised from taxes, which people like me are being told is for the NHS, only to give it to the owners of private companies who don't even spend it in this country? The NHS is massive. It's the largest employer in Europe. It can run all of its services in-house and deliver a much better service to those in need of healing if 100% of the money is being spent on healthcare. Now, the figure widely published in terms of the percentage of NHS funding that goes into private hands is 7%. Now, that is bad enough for me. And even if you genuinely believe in public-private initiatives, the way the Conservatives do it is wholly wrong. Contracts are not awarded on the basis of best for patients or even best value, but on bribery and corruption. So take, for example, the case of Mustafa Mohammed. He is the owner of a company called Genix Healthcare, a company that a few years ago was registered offshore in Dubai, of course, as all these dodgy companies are. At the moment, apparently, no one really knows where it's registered. It's all a bit funny. Now, at the time, Jeremy Hunt was Health Secretary, and he was denying that there's any privatisation of the NHS going on. And he awarded Mr Mohammed £7.3 million of public money for NHS contracts. But where's the corruption in this, apart from Jeremy Hunt lying about privatisation and well as it being maybe a dodgy company with dodgy tax affairs? Well, it's because Mustafa Mohammed donated, just before getting these contracts, £40,000 to the Conservative Party and £20,000 to Jeremy Hunt personally. So you see, you don't even need to bribe Conservative ministers with large sums of money. They're fairly cheap, really. And as I say, even if you believe in private contracts, nobody can justify this method of awarding them. At the end of the day, the Conservative Party, unlike Labour, do not get many ordinary people donating to them. They rely upon large donations from a small number of people. But those small number of people, of course, are the wealthy elites. Now, the wealthy elites are the sort of people who hide their financial affairs to avoid paying their fair share of tax. These are not the sort of people who donate money in the normal sense of the term. They expect a return, and they always get it. So that 7% of our taxes is not only not really going into healthcare as it should, it's not even going into healthcare as efficiently as possible if you accept privatisation. But the problem is this, the 7% figure is not even correct. So this is according to David Rowland, the director of the Centre for Health and Public Interest. He's written a blog with a bit of data analysis in it. I'll link it in the description below for all the gory details. The real figure is about 3 times as high. In fact, it's over 3 times as high. Very much like the unemployment figures. We have got a government, even back as far back as David Cameron, who regularly fiddle the figures, and they're often told about this from the Office for National Statistics about the fact that you are misrepresenting the figures here. So it actually shows that the actual figure is 26% of money that we're paying from our taxes being allocated to the NHS, 26% of it is going in private companies. Now, this would come as a massive shock to many people in the UK, especially people who would or will vote Conservative on the understanding that they are genuinely trying their best for the NHS. This despite the fact that Boris Johnson himself has spoken in favour of a fully private insurance-based healthcare system in the UK. And the Conservatives will eventually get it if we don't wake up. Their strategy is childishly simple. Keep underfunding the NHS while saying that you are pumping more and more billions into it. The NHS will keep failing because the reality is that it is chronically underfunded, even though we're all paying for it from our national insurance contributions. Frankly, it's fraud. But anyway, the NHS keeps failing, the government keeps saying they're increasing the funding. They keep up the narrative that the concept of the NHS is impossible to maintain because look, it keeps failing. We keep pumping billions and billions of pounds into it, but it keeps failing. The whole system is fundamentally flawed. And they eventually make the case for more and more privatisation until we end up with the American system. And although I say eventually, I don't think we're necessarily talking in a generation's time. We are potentially just a few short years away if Boris Johnson gets his way with both the election and with Brexit. Because never mind that Trump may not be president for much longer. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. That doesn't matter. The next president will just carry on the same path. This, of course, benefits American businesses. Even a decent US president will pursue it. It is their job to do what's best for America, not Britain or mankind in general. And the attitude to public healthcare is a little different in the UK compared to the US as well. Yes, I know polls show a majority of Americans who want healthcare for all, but the government don't listen to that any more than the British government listen to the UK public. But American policy is set by well-funded lobby groups. In the UK, it's more by newspapers. After all, as I've already shown, you don't actually have to even be that well-funded to bribe a Tory government. In fact, I could save up enough in a reasonable amount of time to bribe a Tory minister if I so desired. But where it can differ is in the attitude to taxes. Quite a lot of Americans tend to be quite keen on low taxation government. This is not the case in the UK. I mean, sure, Conservative politicians will tell you all the time that what people want are tax cuts. But polls paint a different picture. Polls consistently show that the British public are absolutely fine paying taxes. They don't grumble about taxes as long as it's been spent on good quality public services. In fact, there was a poll earlier this year that showed a large majority of the British public would pay more in taxes if it means the NHS were properly funded. Because what they don't know is it could be properly funded at the current taxation levels. And it's such a powerful icon. This is why the likes of Boris Johnson made the false pledge on the side of his Brexit bus. He not only lied about the amount of money we pay to the EU, but linked that so-called money saved to increased funding for the NHS. He could have promised to use the money to fund all sorts of currently underfunded public services. Could have been used for schools, the police, the fire service, social services. No, it was the NHS. Because the NHS is the country's most loved public service. It's the one that most people access. And it's why the Conservatives will never admit to cutting funding for it, even when the documentation shows otherwise. Other services, They do sometimes say, oh, we've got to make cuts. They'll try and justify it, but they will say it. They will never, ever, ever say that about the NHS because it will lose them votes. The fact is that the general public are so out of kilter with Conservative aims in the UK these days, the only way the Conservatives can ever get into power is to lie their tits off. And so they do. And so as to that figure, 26% of NHS expenditure is going into private hands. Now, for those who don't want to read the blog, though I recommend that you do, it comes largely as a result of reclassifications. Now, it reminds me of an old episode of Yes, Prime Minister from my childhood. So in it, the head of the civil service, Humphrey Appleby, he needs to get a pay rise for himself and the civil service. But the Prime Minister is saying he wants a reduction in the cost of the civil service. Now, you can't just give all civil servants a pay rise and get an overall reduction in the cost because the cost would go up. So what does he do to achieve this? He reclassifies, amongst other fiddles, he reclassifies a load of civil servants as something else. So they're not called civil servants anymore. So that means he can get his pay rise and the overall civil service wage bill looks lower. He can hand a piece of paper to the Prime Minister and says, look, we've reduced it by 5%, but in reality he's got his pay rise. The government are still shelling out more money on the wages, but it's all hidden in the paperwork. And the same trick is at play here. So the way it's currently hidden in the case of the NHS is that money paid to voluntary services or local authorities isn't counted as private expenditure, even when those voluntary services and local authorities are simply funneling the money to private companies. So the money is going to private companies, but it's not classed as going into private companies. So if you're someone who thinks that there is a threat to the NHS from privatisation, but that it hasn't happened yet, think again. Over a quarter of the taxes that we're paying to the NHS are going into private hands. And by increasing this figure, you can see how easy it is for the Conservatives to claim that they keep funding the NHS, but that it keeps failing. Of course it keeps failing because passing on an increasingly greater proportion of NHS money to bank accounts outside of the UK is not helping the service to treat the sick. And also, as a little double whammy or even triple whammy, depending on how you see it, the Conservatives are getting a little bit of donation money from the people they're awarding these contracts to. And given the basis of awarding these contracts is on corruption, there's a very high likelihood that they're awarding the contracts to people who are not actually that good. So they're providing a poorer service for the money than a better private company would even. So it all helps to undermine the NHS as well. Win, win, win for the Conservatives, but lose, lose, lose for the rest of us. And this is why the upcoming general election is so important and why it's also so important to get this message out. A Boris Johnson victory this December doesn't just mean years of cruel Tory government, it means a hard Brexit. And both of them will have been won on lies. If a majority of the public knew full well what was coming and still voted for it, well, that's democracy, that's the way it is. But that's not the case. Both of these events, Brexit and a Boris Johnson government, would combine to make for an NHS that will actually be beyond rescue by the time a Labour government does finally manage to win power again. That's the reality we may well face. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.